edition for this year before we go into our short holiday hibernation. So before we begin, I would like to, as usual, thank the team of Disruption Network Lab that is staying behind me for the production, and also the Boiling Head production for their amazing streaming support that we have over the years and also today with us. I would also like to invite the audience to feel free and welcome and join the chat on our website and ask questions for our speakers or share relevant links or ideas. At the end of the talk, we usually forward them to the moderator, and then some of them are being asked. In this way, we really invite you to use your chance and be able to become part of the conversation. Today, you will be able to hear the closing session of our project Facing Disinformation, Media Diversity from Georgia to Germany. This is a project that started in June this year, and it was running basically till the beginning of December. And we are realizing it in cooperation with the Georgian nonprofit organization, Regional Democratic Hub Caucasus. The project is also financially supported by the German Federal Foreign Office as part of their expanding cooperation with civil society in the Eastern Partnership countries and Russia. This project aims to encourage and support media pluralism in Georgia, connecting experts such as journalists of traditional and non-traditional media, lawyers and researchers with professionals in Germany, through online formats, including specialized online training courses and online conference sessions. Working with experts on disinformation and fake news in Georgia and Germany, the project offered important insights on how to face disinformation in social media and beyond. So this year, as I said, it started in June, but previously since October till the beginning of December, we had a lot of workshops running. And on the 12th of November and today, we are having two public discussions with various experts also on disinformation and fake news from Georgia and from Germany. So I will not take too much of your time. I would like to give the floor to Maya Talakhadze, who is one of the leaders of this project in Georgia, but also today's moderator of this edition, to guide us through this talk. So Maya, please go ahead.
Thank you, Elena. That was really great introduction of our project and our Disruptive Friday events. Thanks a lot to you, Disruption Network Lab, that did a really great job within this project, and you are for being a really great partner for this project and previous project that was conducted last year. Yes, disinformation is a virus, and it became more acute in the time of global pandemic. Many conspiracy theories have been developed and spread virally during the 2 years, and it had a direct impact, absolutely, to the people's health and even lives. What is behind the intention of the conspiracies, and who stands behind the fake news, and what is the role of the media in it? How disinformation was spread in media during coronavirus in Germany, in Georgia, or in any other countries? This very important topic will be discussed today by our excellent speakers. They are Ketevan Khutsishvili, Ivan Sigal, and Tina Lee. From the outset, I would like to give the floor to Ketevan, who will end COVID-19 disinformation in Georgia. Before her presentation, I would present her. Ketevan is a fact checker and a journalist, and she is a deputy editor at Meet Detector at Media Development Foundation in Tbilisi, Georgia. And as we have a diverse audience today, I believe. I will add that Meet Detector is Media Development Foundation's project aimed at debunking fake news and studying propaganda methods and strategies revealed in Georgia language media. Ketevan, I'm really happy that you are here today with us, and I will give the floor to you.
Hello. First of all, thank you for having me. Today I'm going to talk about the COVID disinformation in Georgia, which is a huge topic, and I will try to fit the most important points in 10 minutes that is given to me. First of all, I would like to talk about our organization. I cannot change slides, unfortunately, so if we could go to the next slide. Yeah, so before the slides change, I will say a few words about the organization that I'm representing. So Media Development Foundation and our project, Misdetector, is working with Facebook. Since the Facebook has realized and other social media networks have realized that disinformation is a huge problem on their networks, they started working with independent fact checkers. One of them is our organization. We're identifying these false narratives on their platform and then providing users with alternative informations that are fact-based. And we're also a member of the Poynter Institute's International Fact-Checking Network. And throughout our monitoring of social media and traditional media, we have prepared last year the report on infodemic in Georgia. I would like to talk about some most important points from this report. Can we go to the next slide? And the slide after that. We put these actors in 4 different categories, which is the political actors with political agenda. These are Facebook accounts linked to the Kremlin and anti-Western media outlets who are connected directly and indirectly to Kremlin. There are actors with, who represent anti-liberal groups like clergy, ultranationalist and religious Facebook accounts. Of course, there are anti-vaxxers, both individual real Facebook accounts and fake accounts. And there are actors with economic interests, such as, for example, clickbait websites. If we go to the next slide, we can see that all these actors are not separate from each other, but they are interconnected, and they sometimes share the message box, and they spread sometimes the same kind of disinformation. If we go to the next slide, we can see the main messages and how often they were spread during the last year. And we can see that the denial of pandemic and coronavirus, the existence of coronavirus in general, was most prominent last year. And then on the second place was the vaccine hesitancy. But we believe that this year this has changed because the virus has spread so much that it is very difficult to deny that it exists right now. Especially in Georgia, since we got these Western vaccines in the country, the disinformation about vaccination has increased dramatically. On the next slide, we can see that some of the messages that we have been seeing, and I'm not going to talk about all of them. I'm just going to mention some of the most interesting and most viral messages, such as that pandemic was pre-planned, or that vaccines are changing DNA, or are not fully tested, which we have debunked several times. And I'm going to mention some examples of this messaging. For example, on the next slide, we can see the quote from Georgian priest who represents the clergy, and he's saying that the Western vaccines are experimental and that people are waiting for Russian vaccines. And on the next slide, there's another example of this message that Russian vaccines are better than the Western ones, and it is from the Georgian homeopath who is on the, so to say, forefront of the anti-vaccine movement right now, and she's saying that Bill Gates is trying to change the human genome, and these Western vaccines are fulfilling his orders, and on the other hand, people trust Russian vaccines more than the American ones. And on the next slide is another example, another message we have seen from mostly the ultranationalist movements. For example, in this case, the leader of the ultranationalist party in Georgia, and he's saying that coronavirus pandemic is the divine retribution for sins to punish infidels, and in this he's meaning liberal Europe. Apart from these messages, we have seen on the next slide, we can see, for example, the examples of visual manipulation. We have seen altered photos that were changed in Photoshop or altered videos and video manipulations by which these actors were trying to somehow raise the vaccine hesitancy in the population. On the next slide, there are some examples of the actors who were most prominent, so to say, in spreading this disinformation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about them because there have always been people who are afraid of vaccines for one reason or another. But right now, what we are seeing is that some of these groups are trying to instrumentalize these fears and trying to use them for their own gains. For example, we have seen the ultranationalist movements who, before the pandemic, have spread these anti-Western narratives. And right now, they're trying to use this fear for the vaccines for their own gains, and they're supporting these anti-vax movements. And some of them have even created political parties, and some of these parties are openly pro-Russian, for example. And there were already existing parties who were really marginal, and now they're trying to gain following by appeasing this crowd who are anti-vaxxers, for example. As I mentioned, some members of clergy have unfortunately spread these anti-vaccine narratives, and unfortunately our church hasn't made any official statement about them. And there have been media and NGOs who are directly or indirectly connected to Russia or being financed from Russia, who have been giving their platforms to these anti-vaxxers or people who spread disinformation about vaccines without any critique whatsoever. And on the next slide, we can see another actor, which is very active in Georgia, the Russian government-sponsored Sputnik, which has a Georgian branch and also branches in the occupied regions of Georgia. And they have been spreading the same messages about the Western vaccines being bad, Russian vaccines being superior, that West was not able to cope with the pandemic, but Russia was. They even were trying to spread the narrative that Soviet healthcare system was better, but the fact that the Soviet Union was concealing information about anything doesn't mean that there were no pandemics in Soviet Union or no epidemics. And we have debunked this kind of claim several times. And one of the most important messages from them and most dangerous was that Americans were conducting biological experiments and collecting biological data. On the next slide, the slide after that, we can see the documents that were leaked from the Lugar laboratory. So the Lugar laboratory is one of the best laboratories in the region. And it has been instrumental in diagnosing COVID-19 in Georgia. And it has been under the cyber attack, and some documents were stolen from it, namely some emails and some internal documents. When we look at these documents, we can see that they do not contain anything incriminating themselves. They're just like salaries for employees and such. But some actors have tried to use these documents to manipulate public opinion that something really shady is going on in the Lugar laboratory. For example, on the next slide, we can see that the messages that have been spread against Lugar laboratory, for example, that they are conducting some experiments with bats, and they were trying to connect this laboratory to the emergence of COVID-19. When we looked into this matter, we saw that these experiments on bats are conducted not only in Georgia, but in many countries, including Russia, and have no connection whatsoever to COVID-19. There was also one of the narratives that some experimental drug was being tested in this laboratory, but it turned out that this drug is not experimental and it is approved and widely used in Russia, for example. And we have seen these narratives coming not only from Russian state-sponsored media, but Russian state itself, because quite often the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, and the spokesperson for the ministry, Maria Zakharova, have mentioned Lugar laboratory and have said that they do not know what is going on in the laboratory, that it is very dangerous for Russia, and that there might be some experiments going on and some biological weapons being prepared in this laboratory. And they have spread this kind of disinformation themselves. And when we look at the actors who have been spreading this disinformation, on the next slide, we can see that they are also connected one way or another to the Russian government. For example, this woman on the slide is Bulgarian journalist Dilyana Gaitanjeva, who was the first one to publish this leaked document from Lugar laboratory. And when we investigated this matter, we saw that she is also connected to TV Zvezda, which is the official TV channel for the Russian Ministry of Defense, and also Sputnik, which is Kremlin-sponsored media. And she has been using in her reports also as the respondents, people who are also themselves connected with Russia some way or another. For example, this person on the slide, Georgi Rebadze, who is also a founder of the pro-Russian youth organization, is himself connected with these TV channels. And on the next slide, we can see another example, which might be more familiar to the German audience. This is a German journalist, Billy Six, who visited Georgia, and he published a video from Batumi Hospital in March, and he was claiming that the hospital rooms were empty, and so the government was lying about the pandemic and was inflating numbers, and that pandemic was not a real threat. And Georgian anti-vaxxers really quickly picked up his videos, but it turned out that actually he was not in the COVID-19 ward, he was in the dialysis ward, and that's why there were no COVID patients there. And then we decided to investigate his background, and we found out that he was arrested in Syria and in Venezuela. On this photo, you can see him with the ambassador of Russia into Damascus and Syrian foreign minister. And in both cases, he was freed with the help of Russian diplomacy. After freeing from Venezuelan prison, his father even thanked Sergei Lavrov directly. And after this, he had appeared in the documentary, which was prepared by the Russian state-sponsored media, Russia Today. It was about the shooting down of the Malaysian airplane in eastern Ukraine. And Billy Six was saying in this documentary that Western media was spreading disinformation about Russia. So when we look at these narratives and when we look at where they are coming from, it is pretty clear that they have one source and they have a clear political agenda and aim. And on the last slide, I would like to leave you with the web pages of our organization, where you can find all our fact checks on these topics that I mentioned and all our research. And I will be glad to answer any questions you have if I managed to tell everything in 10 seconds.
Katie, thank you so much. That was really interesting and a really nice overview what has happened during the pandemics in terms of disinformation. Before I start a question and before we go to the next speaker, I would like to tell to our audience that we have a chat and you can text us any kind of questions, and I'm sure you have some in terms of this topic and connected to Ketevan's topic and all others that will be presented today. Before I go to the next speaker, I would like to ask you, Ketevan, a very short and quick question regarding Lugar laboratory. Actually, it was not the first time the pandemics that Lugar laboratory became a victim, I would say weak team in this disinformation context, and it has been like many times there were so many disinformation regarding this laboratory, and you also mentioned in your presentation in terms of C hepatitis and as well as different testing, biology, etc. I would like to ask you, what do you think? What is supposed to be done in order to avoid future such kind of disinformation? Because it is not connected only on only pandemics and COVID-19, but if I ask specifically, going supposed to do. Thank you.
Yes, you're right. This kind of disinformation was present even before the COVID-19, and this laboratory and also other such laboratories in every post-Soviet state where they exist have been under attack from Russian state or Russian state-sponsored actors. And in all cases, they were alleging that Americans are using these laboratories to somehow make some bioweapons there. And what should be done? Well, to prevent it, it should be more secure from the cyber attacks, such as was the case for the Lugar laboratory. But also it's very important that the information is shared quickly to counter this disinformation being spread, because when we reached out to the Lugar laboratory, to the Ministry of Health, to the National Center of Disease Control, they answered our questions about these leaked documents, about what they contained actually, and about what experiments were being conducted. So we were able to prepare the fact check on this matter and to provide public with the real information. And this is important in case of COVID-19 as well, because right now the communication with authorities is not that great. We're not getting the information as fast as we would like to counter this disinformation. And I think this is the most important, to not leave the vacuum on the questions that public has, because then this vacuum is going to be filled by these malign actors who are trying to spread the disinformation.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Now I would go to the next speaker. This is Ivan, who will speak about COVID-19 investigation in media. Ivan is a Global Voices executive director since the middle of 2008. And priorly, he was working 10 years. During 10 years, he was working in media development in the former Soviet Union and Asia. And he was supporting and training journalists and working on media cohesion. In 2012, he published White Road, a chronicle of travel in Central Asia. Ivan is also a photographer, and Ivan, first of all, thanks a lot for being here today with us, and over to you.
Thank you. Nice to be here. So very briefly, I'll explain what Global Voices is for those of you who don't know it. We are a large multinational network of writers and translators and rights activists who focus on building understanding across communities with a strong emphasis on explaining and amplifying local contextual information for global audiences in a multilingual context. So we have about 1,000 people a year who write or translate for us, many of them who are volunteers. And we also publish our content in upwards of 40 languages through a large translation network that is almost exclusively volunteer oriented. We're a big part of the open knowledge kind of ethos in online spaces. We have a special focus on online human rights, digital rights, and access and amplification of minority and underrepresented language communities. And we also do rerun on an ongoing basis a range of research projects. And the one I'm going to talk about today, the Civic Media Observatory, is our most active research project at the moment. It's been running various iterations of it for the last 2.5 years. So today, let's see if the slides work. Next slide, please. Thank you. I'm not going to read all of these slides because I feel there's a lot of text in this one, but basically the Civic Media Observatory is a research method which we build in order to find, assess, describe, and analyze local information, and trying to explore the lack of contextual and subtextual information in global media, and the lack of language skills in our primary audiences, which are media, policymakers, internet platforms, and interested audiences interested in in alternative views and diversity of international stories. And we started this project because in looking over the landscape of misinformation, disinformation studies, and in working for almost 17 years on questions of how people absorb information coming from communities that are. One thing that we've come to realize is that it's not only about the factuality or the facticity of information. It's not only about whether it's true or false that influences people's ability to understand it. Very often it's equally about entrenched beliefs and perspectives that have significant influence over whether we accept information as credible. And these belief structures are legible when we look at narratives that underlie how we share information. So narratives being how we talk about issues, the unstated assumptions, the subtextual and contextual relationships in which information is framed. So this project is really about identifying narratives that underlie the information that is being shared that maybe is being fact-checked or being explained in other contexts. We take an ecosystem approach to understanding information. We're not only looking at news sources, but all of the sources that we can find, online, offline, news, informal media, everything. It could be a PhD thesis. And we also are trying to explain information in a structured way. So I'll explain that in just a second to see if I can get to the next slide. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is a brief description of how we collect information. So we are not, the analysis method is a kind of deep reading, but we structure it because we're working across many communities and many cultures and many languages. We want to make sure that everything we do has a systematic effect. So we work in a relational database called Airtable, in which we're building information structures so that we can compare the information that we have across many different contexts. And this is a brief taxonomy of our information architecture. And you'll see that we also have specific outputs. We have a weekly newsletter, we do research reports, and we share specific kinds of information with particular partners for whom it's most important. I'll also want to mention really quickly that in our diagnosis of this problem, we really want to focus, our aim is to focus on the intermediaries, because for better or worse, that's media channels and the social media platforms, because for better or worse, they right now have the power with their architecture, with their market power, with their power of attention to make concrete changes in what information is received. So rather than only building large databases of information and sharing them directly with audiences, which we do, but we really want to push that information to policymakers, to social media platforms, and to others. And we work with them on both of those types of communities on a regular basis in order to try to make a difference with the information we're finding. Next slide, please. Oops. This is a taxonomy of how we treat or score the information that we find. And this is very important because when we talk about disinformation, we often assume that there's an equivalence of harms. And so what we're trying to do is to help our readers understand that there's a difference between information that has kind of a level of harms which might be might reach the level of hate crime, might be widely dispersed, might be inciting violence, might have other forms of specific online real-world harms, offline real-world harms, versus other types of information which might be wrong, but not necessarily widely spread, not necessarily impactful in a large way. So we ask our analysts and researchers to always try to make an assessment of whether or not something is harmful. We also are looking for good information that we want to amplify. So we're not only looking at bad information, we're doing, again, an ecosystem approach in which we're finding information that is positive, that is helpful, and we're amplifying that information. Next slide, please. Our projects, this is a brief snapshot of the projects we've done over the past 2.5 years. I'm not going to go into them in depth. I'm going to focus today on the COVID-19 research, which we ran from January to December of 2020. We still do COVID-19 analysis, but now we do it wrapped into other country-level monitoring projects. But we have, next slide, please. And the one after this. In our COVID-19 investigation, over the period of time in which we ran it, we have over 1,300 media items in which we analyzed, and importantly, we found well over 200 important media narratives across the primary countries in which we were doing research, which were Russia, Nigeria, India, Hong Kong, not a country, but part of the country, Hong Kong, and Brazil. Next slide, please. This slide and the next slide are two snapshots of some of the narrative frames that we're looking at, and just to give you a sense of what we're doing in terms of identification of narratives. Next slide, please. And in the time I have remaining, I'm going to briefly show you 2 or 3 examples of cases at the intersection of COVID-19 narratives and religion. So this first one is an example of a audio recording that's posted on Telegram and shared across social media groups across the North Caucasus. And the headline is that doctors have proven that the body's temperature reaches 42 degrees Celsius when you perform the zikr. Zikr is a widespread devotional dance of Sufi Muslim origin, and the claim in this particular item is that that performing the zikr can present no threat of infection to many participants. It was shared through numerous channels. We have it in Telegram and WhatsApp, and we explain the possible impacts. This is an example of how we will present our materials. So we explain the possible impacts. We point to the narrative frames. In this case, the narrative frame is that religious belief protects us from COVID-19, and explain the related themes and also the popularity of the given item. The civic impact of -3. It was shared widely among this community and had a particularly probably virulent impact. And then we also have a set of related items, and in our database you can track through the relational architecture of it, you can track items that are similar to it. Next slide, please. Here's another item, which is a positive kind of counterexample to the one I just shared. It's a Telegram post from Fortanga.org, which is an independent collective of bloggers and citizen journalists from Ingushetia, in which they present a video of a crowd of men also holding a zikr ceremony in violation of local distancing regulations. The narrative frame here, coming from an independent watchdog type of organization, is that religious groups undermine the pandemic response. And they shared this across in Ingushetia and across their community. So it's an example of how one can use the same approach to counter that the same approach is being used by local communities to kind of counter misinformation or disinformation tactics. And a last one, if I have time, is an example also in this case from Russia, which is titled "After Obligatory Certification, Medicines Must Be Legitimized by the Church." And the narrative frame here is that religious groups undermine pandemic response. Also shared, this is a Telegram item that was shared at least 17,000 times at the time of analysis. Brief about medical equipment being blessed and comparing kind of archaic church traditions with scientific approaches. And it is an image that was taken from a different time and misused to claim that it was being presented during the time related to a particular COVID activity. It's harmful, but it's not incredibly harmful in relationship to some of the other items we've seen. So the civic impact is -1. I'll stop there. I believe I believe my time is up, but I'm looking forward to talking more about this in our conversational space. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ivan. That was absolutely very interesting. I see now that our audience is giving us questions. I would read out one of them from our chat. Someone is asking, did you find any disinformation sponsored by the persons affiliated to the government in any country? Maybe.
Oh yes, absolutely. And I should mention that state and state affiliated disinformation is absolutely the largest threat that we see, and the most dangerous threats. We actually try to stay away from language like infodemic or that information is a virus. We think of it as actually quite different than that. It is. We try to break the idea that information has the same kind of characters as a virus, because that's not what our analysis necessarily shows, by the way. But I will say that government, intentional disinformation is the most harmful from state actors who actually have punitive authority, control over violence, ability to arrest and control information at large scale. It is absolutely the biggest threat that we see, and something that is needs to be addressed through multiple different paths and approaches. We are, and as a last point, I'll say that I think something that's absolutely crucial is that we not only react to the levels of state-sponsored disinformation that we saw, for example, in the last presentation, but that we attempt to build trustworthy and strong and healthy information ecosystems of our own, and make sure that the content and stories and communities that we're building have their own kind of resilience and identity over time. And we spend our time not only playing whack-a-mole with bad information that's coming from other sources, but absolutely focusing really hard to build multiple communities of trustworthy information. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks. At the same time, I'm watching the timing, and now I would like to give the floor to Tina Lee, who is a writer, editor, and researcher focused on migration, media, and far right. She is head of publication at Hostwriter, and an award-winning network that helps journalists easily connect across borders. Tina is a editor-in-chief of unbiasednews.org. That is a cross-border feminist newsroom based in Berlin, and she was the editor of the book Unbiased the News by Diversity Matters for Journalism, and it was published in 2019. Tina, to you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. It was really interesting to hear the presentations of the other two speakers so far, and I agree a great deal with what has already been expressed about some of the sources and problems with disinformation. What I want to talk a little bit about today is what we're doing at our newsroom, but also what more generally is problematic about the lack of diversity in the media field. And I mean that in the way of the fact that there is increasingly concentration in the ownership of the media, but also that within media organizations that there is a lack of representation of the diverse societies that we live in, whether that is sexual and gender diversity, whether that is racial diversity, ethnic diversity. And that when we have a lack of representation of communities, that we see it much easier to misrepresent them or to fall into narratives of blame, racism, or populism. So the organization that I'm working for, unbiasedthenews.org, where I'm the editor-in-chief, one of the questions that we wanted to really focus on is who is left out of international media coverage. And there are a lot of reasons why journalism is not very diverse, where it tends to be kind of class-based, lacks class-based diversity, but also very often in most countries doesn't express the kind of fullness of society. in our book, Unbiased, the News, Why Diversity Matters for Journalism, we interviewed 30 journalists, journalists from all over the world contributed pieces about what is preventing more diversity in their countries. For example, in Germany, where 1 out of 4 people come from a migration background, we see that this is not at all represented inside newsrooms, where only 6 of all the editors in German newsrooms have some kind of migration background, and of those, none of them have ever been the subject of racism, meaning that they come from countries like Poland, the Netherlands, and places like that. We also see other kinds of diversity being not being expressed. And one of the things that you see for that is also a lack of interest in sort of local stories that have local impact. Rather, journalism grants tend to go towards people who are writing stories that will have a more international or big impact. And although those stories are really important and deserve funding as well, stories that have a sharp local impact also deserve to get funding, even if those ones wouldn't make it into international press, but would make a big impact in the local areas where they come from. So when we started our newsroom, we were trying to address these different kinds of diversity. You can learn all about our network online at unbiasednews.org, and also at HostWriter, where we have a sort of network for journalists all over the world. And what we have done in our first year of publication is try to select pieces from all over the world, pay everybody the same, and to really try to encourage collaboration and people who are from backgrounds that are not that often represented in the media to apply. Our international news team has helped people, our international editorial board, which has journalists from 5 different countries, were also there to kind of make sure that we had a good reach on what kind of issues might be important for different countries, and that the decision making wasn't just up to one person, which is another way of diversity being quashed. So as I said, you can go into our principles and everything on our website, but what I wanted to talk today is a little bit of kind of the examples of issues I'm talking about where in the coronavirus pandemic, a lack of diversity and also a history of misrepresenting different communities had led to false narratives being produced. One of the cases that we started with, or one of the articles that we started with, is about vaccine hesitancy in Nigeria. And so many of you are probably familiar with the fact that vaccine hesitancy for conspiracy theories, for religious reasons, for QAnon is a factor all over the world. But we had a pitch from Nigerian authors from the state of Kano in Nigeria, a place where there was a different form of vaccine hesitancy based on lived experience. And we asked these authors to go and tell the story of what happened in the 90s there, where the vaccine producing company Pfizer had tested another vaccine there on meningitis on children without asking permission from the parents. And in addition to that, killed some of the children in the process, and other ones were permanently injured. The memories of that vaccine testing has led to widespread distrust of vaccines in that state. And that's a different reason to be distrustful of vaccines than reasons like conspiracy theories and religious ones, and it needs to be addressed in a different way. So we thought that it gave an example of the kind of complexity that can be missed or quashed when there's not representation of complex stories in the media because of the fact that the media is not very diverse and doesn't tell a lot of different stories. And we actually heard from UNDP afterwards that said that they would take this into consideration when messaging on vaccine hesitancy in Kano State. And we think that there are a lot of situations like that where it's for misunderstandings, but also for misinformation to spread because of the fact that there have been missing context, missing histories, and communities that didn't have the chance to tell their story. Coming back to the German example, I would just give 2 short examples of the situations in Germany where you saw misrepresentation of communities during the coronavirus. So the Roma community which has a large history in Germany, a large population in Germany, was slandered during the coronavirus outbreak in 2020 when a big outbreak occurred in a neighborhood in Berlin. There was a big shutdown, and the newspapers ran with the story that the hygienic, the lack of hygiene of the Roma communities that were living in these areas and the overcrowding of the houses were the reasons for the pandemic spreading worse there. Later, it turned out that a lot of the aspects of the story that were expanded upon were untrue. First of all, it wasn't true that the flats were overcrowded. It wasn't true that they were unhygienic. Now, you can see how this cuts on both sides. On the one hand, it was disinformation, which would lead people to be more prejudiced against Roma community, which is already facing a lot of prejudice in Germany. On the other hand, though, it led people to false conclusions about what kind of things spread the coronavirus pandemic and how best to prevent it from spreading. If people believed that the main issue was hygiene or overcrowding or things like this, and not recognizing that some of the issues that were going on were the fact that people were in contact with a lot of people because they were working in jobs which put them into contact with more people, then it would lead people to have different kinds of prevention because of the fact that they were spreading these false things. So it was also creating an idea that a certain kind of person is more likely to have COVID than everyone else, which of course was not the case. In Germany, some of the first cases that came were coming from wealthy skiing individuals who had been on holiday in Switzerland. But this kind of blame game against rich skiing people didn't really come that much out because if you're a journalist in Germany, the chance that you go on a ski holiday is a lot higher than the chance that you're from the Roma community. So I think that this lack of representation can cause these kind of stereotypes to spread more freely. Another example is the fact that there was very little reporting whatsoever on what was going on inside asylum shelters and asylum homes in Germany, where there was almost a total lockdown, where people were, in some cases, forbidden from leaving the shelters, were not able to even leave to get food. Some places, the cleaning staff had left. People were panicking. They were sheltered together with people who had tested positive for coronavirus and weren't being told which people had tested positive and which people had tested negative. They were given mandatory testing without being able to sometimes access the results. And they also had a lack of access to Wi-Fi and had to buy them from the guards that were charging exorbitant prices. How do we know any of those things? Because there was a project done by the International Women's Space where they asked for voice memos from the women that were inside of these refugee shelters themselves to ask them to file diary reports about what was going on, a form of community journalism that accessed an inaccessible group of people, which otherwise wouldn't have made it because there was a real lack of curiosity from the German press to find out what was going on with migrants, because as the aforementioned lack of migration background of the German press I've mentioned before, but also the fact that these people were very closed off and didn't have a chance to get their story out elsewise. So I would say that these are kind of some examples that demonstrate how false representation can happen when communities are underrepresented and how we need to strive for more diversity, both in ownership, in what kinds of media we have out there. Global Voices is a great example of a project which gives a lot more diversity, and then also in the kinds of people who can become journalists and who are allowed to enter in the journalism field. As I say, communities that are underrepresented get misrepresented, and we're seeing that once again now with the extremely racist coverage of the Omicron variant, where images of Black faces are being used in all sort of exploitative ways. So the German media hasn't learned its lesson yet, but I'm hoping that we can continue to unbias the news together. Visit my website for more information, and you can also follow me on Twitter at Tina Lee in Berlin.
Thank you, Tina, and many thanks for being on time. And I see that we have just a couple of minutes left, but I have to read out a very interesting question in the chat that is coming from the audience. This is also very important for Georgia context. There is a question: what Germany particularly does to reach the ethnic minorities who do not speak German or English? I suppose he or she is asking the people who do not understand official languages or mainly spoken languages. In the what are the ways Germany reach them to have access on the proper information?
I would say they're not doing enough. Elena's also living in Germany. Maybe you disagree with me, but I would say that there's a long way to go in trying to have more linguistic diversity for a country that has always been linguistically diverse, and where something like a quarter of the people have Turkish background. We're seeing that it's getting slightly better in government materials online being available in Turkish and in English, but that also doesn't really account for the large diversity where Germany has become a migration magnet country with a lot of people who speak Russian, Hebrew, Spanish, and all other languages. And we, I think, don't see enough of that. So I would say they're not doing enough. And there is definitely a hunger for it from the population also to have more media sources in different languages.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. I think we still have some more minutes before we wrap up. And I see that there's questions are coming from audience, and I'm really happy that it is engaging and interactive event today, Disruptive Friday. I think I can ask one more question, and I would ask it about the disinformation that is changing all the time. Actually, what is that is connected to the topic that is going country or another. But I would ask you whether how strong is disinformation connected to COVID-19? For example, from Georgia context and from Georgia example, I can say that when the number of deaths, for example, or mortality, or the number of infected people is increasing, the number of vaccinated people is also increasing. Can we say somehow that, how can you assess, and this question is to all of you, how can you assess how the disinformation connected to the COVID-19, how strong is it? Is it stronger than fear to death, for example? What do you think? Can we start with Ketevan, maybe?
Yeah, sure. For example, in Georgia, there were some people who were afraid of the vaccines, but after some initiatives were implemented, like the money being given out to get vaccinated, they still went and got the jobs. But there are still people who believe that this virus will not affect them, or that their immunity is strong enough. But when they get infected and their health deteriorates, it might be really too late to do anything. So I think we shouldn't depend on this fear of death, and we should have more strong information campaign, because I think information is the only thing that is stronger than this information. And I think that information campaign from the Georgian government should have been stronger and should have started earlier. You talked about this ethnic minorities, and this was the problem in Georgia as well, because in some regions we have ethnic minorities and they did not have enough information in their own languages, and when they were given this information was really scarce, and this was the case for the general public as well. This information campaign started really late, when this information was already being spread, so it was really difficult to reach out to these people and to change their minds later. So I think this information campaign should be more robust from the government, and also media literacy should be the focus of our attention, because people should be able to know how to find out which information is trustworthy and which is not, and how to check this information for themselves.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm quite sure that Disruption Network Lab, as well as Media Development Fund and RDH Caucasus, we are trying our best to get people literacy on different kind of topics in order to be equipped with the strategies and tactics to avoid disinformation and to fight and to face it. Even, would you add something on this topic?
Absolutely. This is a really tricky topic, because we have a lot of what we like to call anecdata about what the effects of disinformation and misinformation are on people. But when you look at this, at the research, it is actually extremely hard to find clarity about the impacts of disinformation and misinformation on people's behavior, especially on complex topics like vaccine hesitancy. So it's one thing to say that in general we know that there are harms, but it's another thing to say we actually know which issue is causing the harm, and then a third thing to say we know which corrective. And we do have the standard recipes like digital literacy, like media literacy and fact checking, but a lot of the data shows that those things are actually not terribly effective. Fact checking has numerous challenges that are faced that face such as that it faces, such as the fact that most fact checks never actually reach the people who were misinformed or disinformed in the first place, and the fact that people's beliefs, people are much more predisposed to accept information that is consistent with their ideology. So even if they see a fact check that corrects the thing that they misbelieve, they're not predisposed to understand it. Which is one reason why we tend to want to work with the intermediaries, so that those fact checks, that misinformation, disinformation is maybe less prevalent in the first place. There's numerous other things that we can talk about in this space, but in general, I think it's really important as a last point to recognize that we always focus on the question of like the number of people who we imagine do see misinformation or disinformation. But we rarely actually compare that to the total number of people who are receiving information as a whole. And what that means is that we have in the research, we have a common conception that falsehoods spread faster than truth, for example. However, that is not always the case, and not in every environment, and not according to every measure. So I think the one request I would have for those of us who are working in this space is to pay a lot more attention to the social science and to understand that a lot of the prescriptions we have for correcting misinformation and disinformation are actually not very effective, for all sorts of very interesting reasons that we probably don't have time to. I'll drop a link into the chat on a paper on this topic that will be hopefully pretty interesting.
Thank you. If I modify my question a little bit to Tina, I would say when I mentioned that the number correlates, the number of vaccinated people correlates with the number of mortality and with the number of increased number of infected people. It also, I just made a comparison that it also correlates with the promotional campaigns. As soon as, for example, governments make, not only in Georgia but in other countries as well, as soon as government makes some promotional campaigns, we see that number of vaccinated people also increases. So in these two correlations, could you also assess the strengths of the disinformation connected to COVID-19?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I've noticed from my home country and also here in Germany is that there's a lot of focus on individual people and individual people's role in spreading vaccine mistruths. Like you'll constantly see things about people who are now eating mud in order to counteract the effects of the vaccine, or having their children take different vitamins and supplements and doing all these dangerous things. And there's this kind of level to which we're laughing about how stupid people are and that they think that the vaccine has nanochips in it and At the same time, we didn't spend a lot of time asking what our governments could have done to more effectively counter the effects of COVID-19. In Germany, there were massive waves of corruption with mask sales, with all sorts of exchanges of huge amounts of money at the beginning of the COVID-19 vaccine or COVID-19 pandemic that were not fully examined because we were a lot of times people that refused to get vaxxed, that spread misinformation. There was a lack of protection for workers, for people, like I mentioned before, in asylum shelters. We are spending so much time, I think, focusing on people and who they think and why they won't get the vaccine, and not a lot of time on what are the systemic issues that are making this pandemic prolonged. And I believe that that is to the benefit of certain systemic actors, that we focus rather on our neighbors, that we have a lot of dissent between individual people. And I would, ask us to say, if you spend a lot of time hating your neighbor, talking about how they should die because they didn't get the vaccine, or how stupid they are for believing one thing, what kind of, who does this discourse benefit? It often benefits people who would much rather that you get pissed off at your neighbor than rather that you get pissed off at your government, or at, big companies or other people who are benefiting a lot. So I would say the example that you used before, that when government campaigns go through, that they're really effective, is a demonstration that governments still have really a role to play. As much as we would fear that disinformation campaigns and that individual people who spread lies on the internet are very influential, governments still have a big role to play, and their lack of interest to taking this power seriously is sometimes something that deserves a lot more attention.
Thank you, Tina. Thanks all of you for your questions, maybe for your answers, sorry. Maybe we have 3-4 minutes more, and I have very interesting question to Ivan. You mentioned in your presentation the role of the church and religion during this pandemic, and my question is connected directly not to the churches and religion, but my question is connected to the institutions that has a high ranking of trust from people, from population. We have several examples that this institution whom trust the people do not have specific position toward the vaccination, public position, say, toward the vaccination or this virus. And what do you think? What is the role of media in it? For example, if we are talking about church that you mentioned in your presentation, we have some examples that on the one hand they are not against the vaccination, but on the other they say that the leaders say that they cannot support the obligatory vaccination, and how this information is perceived from your perspective, and if we come back to the role of the media in this chaotic situation of so many social media today, so many sources of getting information, what is the role of media is in it? The institutions, for example, has high trust from the population, from the citizens, do not have, like, on the one hand they say that yes, this is a threat, and yes, we are not against vaccination, but not support, for kind of they have neutral position in it.
So that's a pretty complicated question, and we don't have a lot of time. So let me see if I can say something useful in the time we do have. One thing we see in the literature, in the social science literature, is that trustworthy institutions have an outsized effect in opinion formation and ideological opinion formation and narrative formation. And the way that happens, of course, is maybe that sounds pretty obvious and pretty evident, but the narrative we see from the mass media these days is that a lot of the blame for narrative formation is falling on "quote unquote" social media writ large, which makes it sound as if narratives are coming without context out of some kind of unnamed and unknown crowd. So there's a kind of moral panic that's associated with the idea that narratives are coming from places that we don't know and don't understand. But when we look at there's lots of different studies on this that will help us to kind of get very specific about where narratives do come from, and the role that trustworthy institutions have in creating and sustaining them. It is not the case that every narrative always comes from institutions or leaders of institutions, even though, like, we've seen lots of ones. Like, the fact that we're even using the language of fake news in this conversation is because it came from a certain non-gentleman whose name begins with a T. or the fact that we're using the language of infodemic is because the WHO used it, even though social science researchers on information tell us that there is actually not a good correlation between the use of metaphors of virality to what we're actually talking about. But it's a trope we've fallen into because it comes from a source that we tend to trust, so we tend not to dig too deeply into it. What I would say is that it's really important for us to get to try to stay away from generalities and to get very specific about what we mean when we use this kind of language, and to spend some time with the limits of knowledge that we have about how information is formed, how narratives are formed, and how they're transmitted, because we know actually a lot less than we think, and yet we're building responses on the basis of not great intelligence, I would say. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of you. You were brilliant speakers and brilliant. We have a very nice discussion on that, and I think now we are already a little bit over time, and it's time to wrap up. I would like to thank you, all of you. That was really nice to have this Disruptive Friday today with you, and thanks a lot for sharing your experience and sharing your views on different topics that was connected. All of them were connected to COVID-19 and disinformation. Now maybe would give the floor to Elena, who is here from Disruption Network Lab, and we will wrap up this session today. Thank you all. And thanks for the audience who we are watching. I hope it was interesting to you, and it was because we have a lot of questions in the chat, and we do not have time to read out all of your questions. But thanks for all of your interaction, and that each of the questions are really interesting and really. I am a little bit sorry that I cannot post it here with the speakers, but you can text us. All of you have we can post our contacts in the chat, and you can contact us if you have any direct question to any of the speakers. We will transmit it. Thank you once to all of you. Elena, over to you.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you for the great moderation, and also, yes, always grateful to the Georgian audience because they are super active, and each event that we do with you, we have like a really nice, massive following with really engaged questioning. So it's really super that we can finish on such note. We can finish this last Disruptive Fridays. Also, thanks a lot, Tina, Katie, and Ivan for being part of today's edition, and being part of our program. And I hope for some further collaboration with all of you in the year that is coming. So without taking this too long, thanks also for everyone who is watching us and supporting the work of the Disruption Network Lab so far, and I hope to see you all in even bigger numbers in the new year when we will present you the new upcoming program and events. For now, only what's left is to say almost have a nice evening, because here it's almost getting dark in Berlin.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.